So let's sort of step back from these cases, and we're gonna, in a minute. I mean, the problem of free will is in part the problem of, or the challenge of whether these things really are so different. These examples of apparently free choice and apparently unfree choice and action. But let's just stay at this sort of common sense intuitive level for a second and think a little bit about what do the apparent cases of free decision, free choice have in common, and what do the apparent cases of unfree choice and action have in common, and what are some comparisons and contrasts between the two. And I think that once we've done this, it'll start drawing out some themes that we'll be revisiting for the next few weeks, and also motivate the tension, philosophical tension that's at the heart of the problem of free will. So on the left-hand side here, you've got the examples of free choices, free actions. On the right-hand side, unfree choices and actions. Well, I had you read Peter Van Inwagen, a piece by him who gives a very nice, clear, and characteristically rigorous exposition of the problem of free will. Peter Van Inwagen is a living philosopher who teaches at Notre Dame. He is one of the foremost living analytic metaphysicians, which is the area that I work in. And he wrote an influential book in the 80s, I believe, on the problem of free will that really set the tone for the debate and some of the foundational arguments he made for the incompatibility of freedom and determinism for the subsequent decades. But this piece of his is just sort of an introduction to the problem of free will. And he uses this expression that's really useful for understanding what cases of freedom intuitively have in common. He says this: the best way to get an intuitive grip on the concepts of free will and determinism and the relations between them is to think of time as a garden of forking paths. This is his expression, a garden of forking paths. That is, to think of the alternatives one considers when one is deciding what to do as being part of various alternative futures, and to think of these alternative futures diagrammatically in the way suggested by a path or a river or a road that has literal forks. So this idea of free choice as having the feeling, whether it corresponds to reality or not, is going to be part of the challenge, but at least it feels from the inside when I'm making a free choice about what to do, as if I am, almost as if I'm literally standing at a fork in the road. Except instead of a road, it is what feels as if it is a sort of open future. My future has sort of many options, and I get to somehow select one of them and make it real. That's what it feels like from the inside to make a free choice. And this is this idea of the garden of forking paths. This is a version of Van Inwagen's representation of it. So I want to take this idea of a garden of forking paths and try to be a little bit more careful about what we mean by a garden of forking paths. Not that Van Inwagen isn't, because he is later, but take that rough metaphor and try to make it more concrete and more precise. And then once we've done that, we'll see that we have in our hands something that is a statement of what all of those cases of freedom seem to have in common, at least commonsensically, and what it feels like to make a free choice. But then that will also give us what we need to set a kind of baseline necessary condition for the existence of freedom. In effect, what we're going to be saying is, unless things turn out this way, unless this is the way my choices go, I'm not free. At the very least, this is the way reality has to be structured in order for free will to exist. And it's going to be very minimal. It's not going to be a robust theory of freedom. Pretty much everyone in the debate over free will agrees that this necessary condition for freedom really is necessary. So just to be clear, a necessary condition for something In this case, a necessary condition for freedom. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that this is something without which freedom could not exist. If it turns out that this condition is not met, in other words, then we can be sure there's no freedom. The reverse may not hold, so it may not be that this condition, satisfaction, is sufficient all by itself for freedom, but we know that if this condition isn't met, then freedom's just not attainable. Here's the condition, and we're going to call it the ability to do otherwise. This is the informal version. I didn't do action A, where A is just some action, for example, attending Wake Forest. I didn't do that freely. I wasn't free to do that. Unless, and this is the necessary condition, unless at some point I could have not done A. So for example, at least at some point I could have attended Duke, taken a gap year, sat at home for a year, worked, and never gone to college, right? If at least some of those things weren't an option for me, if I didn't have the ability to do at least one of those other things, then my going to Wake was not free. If I wasn't able to avoid going to Wake, if it was unavoidable for me, if I didn't have the ability to do something else. Let's try to make this even more clear. That was the informal version. Here's the formal version that I want you to know. The ability to do otherwise, or AO. So this is a principle. This principle is stating a very general necessary condition for freedom. It's supposed to reflect the idea of a garden of forking paths. Let's let X be an individual, a person, you or me. A be any action whatsoever, such as attending Wake, eating breakfast, stopping to help the person who's dropped their stuff, whatever. And T be some time, the time at which you do the action. All right. So if X does A at T, so for example, if you attend Wake Forest, maybe your decision to sign the dotted line was last year at a particular moment sitting at your kitchen table, suppose. If X does A at T, then X does A freely at that time. You're free when you do it, only if the following is true. Only if X could have done otherwise than A at T. Let me read that again. If X does A at T, then X does A freely at T, only if X could have done otherwise than A at T. Only if, in other words, when you're sitting there at your kitchen table, if it was true of you that you could have avoided signing that dotted line. You could have put down the pen and said, actually, I choose Duke. That has to be true in order for you to have freedom. If it turns out that when we do philosophy and look into the question of freedom more carefully, if it turns out that when you sign that dotted line, there was actually no other possible future for you, then that's not freedom. You had no ability to do otherwise. It's as if you were locked behind a jail cell. So this is why this is supposed to capture the idea of a garden of forking paths. Here's you, the decider, making your decision about what to do. The past is stretching out backwards behind you. You're making your decision at the present moment. There are your options you're deliberating between. And at some point, you strike out 3 of the options and put a check mark next to Wake. And you're like, I'm going to go for Wake. You make your decision and you begin to act. Here's the way the actual future unfolded for you. Here you are at Wake Forest. So the thing you chose was the thing you did. Your future that you wanted for yourself is the one that occurred. The ability to do otherwise condition, or AO, tells us this alone is not enough for freedom. In addition, what we need and what you need for freedom is for it to be the case that that was just one of many possible futures. If that was the only future, the only possible future, then you weren't free. It has to be the case that the future in which you went to Wake was one future among many possible. Perhaps possible future 2 is a future where you take a gap year. Possible future 3 is one where you attend Duke. Possible future 4 is one where you go to Chapel Hill. Most likely there are going to be uncountably many other possible futures as well. This is, you can see the structure of this is the garden of forking paths effectively. In order for me to be free, AO has to be true, and AO's being true is just a matter of this diagram being the way I relate to my future. Where is this coming from? Well, this is coming from, this as a necessary condition for freedom, is coming from just sort of an intuitive reflection on what it feels like to make a free choice. Again, if it turns out that this is the way things are, and there's no other possibility, then intuitively, even if I thought there were many possibilities when I made the choice, that was an illusion. My futures were, there was just one future. I didn't have many possible options as it felt like I did when I made the choice. So in order for me to be free, this garden of forking paths in some way has to be a reality. The feeling of deciding between open possible futures has to correspond to there actually being many possible open futures. By contrast, if you look at paradigm cases of unfree action, another way to get at the reason why AO is a plausible constraint on freedom is that it seems to adequately describe what feels like is going on in the free choices, the paradigm case of free choices, and it also seems to diagnose what goes wrong in the cases of actions and decisions that feel unfree. Why is it that being locked in a jail cell renders your decision to stand there in the jail cell not a free decision? Well, AO explains why. There's no sense in which you could have done anything other than stand there in the jail cell if it's locked and the guards are not going to help you. You only have one future, a future where you stand there in the jail cell. You don't have that branching possibilities. And so that action of yours, staying in the jail cell, is unfree. Likewise, for other kinds of unfree acts, it seems like addiction is something that arguably the drug and the psychological compulsion that comes with it is sort of robbing you of your other options of not taking the drug. There's like only one thing you can do, is take the drug, is the only thing you can do, and you're being sort of forced from outside to do this. Same thing with obsessive compulsive disorders or coercion, right? In some sense, you could disobey the guy with the gun and say, no, I don't think so, I'm going to keep driving, you don't get my car, but you're going to pay the ultimate price for that. And so there, in reality, is not another option of you both living and keeping your car. The only option you have, the only possible future, is one in which you obey the guy with the gun. And that lack of a garden of forking paths is what makes coercion unfree.